Kuzu Zangpo, my dear students, and I hope you all are well and welcome to one more pre-recorded class here. And today we are going to study about drafting of body of the contract. In fact, we already learned about head of the contract, or we actually studied about the fundamentals in terms of drafting. We studied about drafting in a contract drafting that it can be divided into three parts. The first part is known as head of the contract, or we also studied that as a introductory clauses, and then we said that we will also study about body of the contract, and we will study about the concluding part, or we will study about the back side of the contract. So among these three draftings, today we are going to discuss about the body of the contract, and we are going to look at how to draft the main body of the contract. And this main body is the crux of the contract. Because any dispute that arises in any contract, it is this part that is, essentially the one that will bring a dispute in general. And you also studied that in the contracts. In terms of contract drafting, we studied that the contract body is like a human body which consists of different organs in the body, and exactly this is what we are going to study in terms of understanding the drafting of the contract. And therefore knowing how to draft the body of the contract is very important in terms of drafting, and it's also some of the most difficult and tiresome in terms of coming up with the body of the contract, because it generally differs from each contract, the categories of contract that you draft. So therefore this is a very important component in the drafting part. And further, unlike head of the contract or back of the contract, which are quite standard in most of the contracts, body of the contract changes fundamentally depending on the type of contract that you are drafting. And for example, simple private contracts to standard form consumer contracts, to partnership, to insurance companies, to mergers and acquisitions, to very complicated contracts such as business contracts, corporate contracts. So this is going to be the most difficult part of the contract in terms of drafting. But I will not be teaching every aspect of every contract, as there are too many contracts which are beyond the scope of this course. Therefore, I will be teaching the basics, or the fundamentals of body of the contract, and show you how to write those clauses, including organization, layout, and use of proper words, phrases, and styles. And therefore, we are going to look at that in terms of that aspect. So let us first talk about the organization of the body of the contract. We studied about lead-in clause. If you remember correctly, we actually studied lead-in clause right after the recital, and it begins as like example. The parties agree as follows. The parties therefore agree as follows. So the parties agree as follows, and then you put various kinds of things under that. And we learned in previous classes that we will start a body of this contract from that leading, and how the contract will then go into the next part of the body. So layout of the contract body of contract may be grouped into different parts. And so this is, for example, just to give you an idea of how the contract is drafted. So the legend says that the parties agree as follows. So this is a sales state of sales state of a car. So basically, it's a vehicle sales state, and in this. One of the first components that would come into place is the description of that vehicle. So when it was made, what kind of model is it, and the year of, and then kilometers if it's a second hand, and license registration number. So this would in fact have have that, just to give you an example that how the contract would start after the leading clause. And so basically in body of the contract, what we are looking at is, depending on the length of the contract, the body may be organized into different parts and different components and sections. It can also be articles. For example, if the contract is very lengthy, so it is recommended to group the contracts into articles first, and each article can have sections while writing the article numbers, and in terms of that. So we can look at that in terms of looking at that, dividing the contracts into different articles or sections depends on the length of the contract. And generally in contract, what we mention is we provide the conditions, that is basically descriptions, prices, issues. Then we provide rights, what each party is entitled. So basically providing the rights of the tenant, right of the house owner, so we provide that. Then you could also provide obligations of each of the party, what parties must do. So for example, a tenant must pay a rent before fifth day of every month, of in the end of that month, and fifth day of the next month, before the fifth day of the next month. And obligations on the house owner could be like, to ensure that water supply is, always reliable and available 24 hours. So these are some of the obligations that you may have to put in, depending on what kind of contracts that you enter into. And the next is, you look at remedies and penalties. This is very, very important in terms of why do you draft contracts. Is basically you draft contract with a thing, with a intention that if it breaks down, what will happen. So remedies and penalties basically provides, what each party gets if the contract fails. In case of failure of the contract, what do you get out of that? So that is provided under the remedies clauses. And then you could also have a termination clauses sometimes, when does the contract comes to an end. For example, if you buy a car, and then you the contract starts moment you draft contract, and then you give the money, you get the key, and in fact once you get a vehicle, the seller gets the money and the buyer gets the vehicle. That's the end of the contract. So that's the termination clause. There are a lot of termination areas where the contract gets terminated. Sometimes the contract continues. So if there is a termination period, then you provide termination clauses in that. Then you could also have other, other conditions, depending on the type of the contract. So basically, that other conditions could be warranties, guarantees. So depending on if it's insurance, so these things are in fact looked at in terms of understanding the contracts. Now we are going to look at the categories of language that we use. So it's very important. In general considerations, something for something. So basically, Newton 4,000 for a car. So that would be general considerations. And then in terms of language of the agreement, you generally says that the parties agree as follows, as you have seen. That is generally the language of the agreement. And then we can have a language of performance, hereby agrees to pay. So agrees to pay means that payment is a performance. So agrees to pay, agrees to receive, hereby receives, hereby, in fact constructs. So these are some of the language of the performance. Then you also have the language of obligation. So generally, if it's an obligation, you provide shall, must, will. So Mr. X must, Mr. Y must, Mr. Y will. So these are some of the languages of the obligation. And then language of discretion. May means that the buyer may, in fact, provide discount. So discount that is may, whenever you use word may, it generally signifies you give the discretion to the other party in terms of drafting the contract. So it's not a mandatory, so it may, whereas shall means it is a mandatory. Then language of prohibition. So you also know that you enter into contracts. Contracts is basically to do or refrain from doing. So therefore you use that to, in terms of drafting, you use shall not, shall refrain from, must not. So this is a prohibitory. He must not allow his cow or his cattle into Mr. Y's garden. So that is must not. So it basically prohibits that party from. And then the language of policy. This agreement terminates. So basically these are some of the general conditions that is dictated by the policy. So, for example, Contract Act of Bhutan 2013 govern all matters arising out of this contract. So that is a policy agreement. That is a policy language that you put in. Interest is payable at a rate determined per year as per the Financial Services Act. In violation of this agreement shall be violated. So these are some of the languages of the policy. So this is a simple example of body of the contract, and so basically, if you look at this in terms of body of the language of the contract, so today we are going to just discuss about how a body would look like, and we have seen that the different languages being used for the body of the language of the contract, as well as we have also looked at kind of categories of contracts. So these are the important pieces that one must understand that you have to put in while writing the contract. So we are going to look at this from that perspective, and then I will take in the questions, and based on that, so we will do some exercises in due course of time. So therefore, this is just to introduce you the body. We have a few more classes on this, and we will try to, in the next class, we will try to look at more detail in terms of using the words and structuring the, in fact, articles, structuring the sections. And just to give you an idea that whenever you write after the lead-in, you must provide numberings to each of the, clauses that you write, so that it is easy to understand. If you say clause 3, the number 3 is there. So therefore, whenever you write sections, whenever you write any contracts, you must remember that there is a numbering, enumeration provided there, and then based on that, your contracts are actually designed. So with this, today's in terms of understanding the basics of how a body of the contract would look like. So generally, body of the contract would look like general conditions, rights, obligations, and then it can also have policy statements. And then you could have different conditions. So these are some of the important things that you have to keep in mind while understanding how to draft a contract. And then, so basically, as I told you, contract drafting is not really about the theoretical part, but more to do with more to do with the understanding of how to in fact draft contracts, and is a skill based. So these classes require far more in fact effort from you guys than myself explaining to you. Is basically I have not much to explain to you. I am just here to guide you how to go about drafting a contract, and then it is up to you how to in fact improve your skills in terms of drafting the contract. And obviously we will have a major assignment in this in terms of course evaluation at the end of the semester. So with this, we are coming to the I'm coming to the end of the presentation on drafting the body of the contract, and then I will explain further in the next class, so that we will be able to in fact understand more in depth about how to go about these conditions. So with this, I would like to, in fact, thank all of you for watching this a small, in fact, presentation. And if you have any questions, I will open the floor to all of you in the Zoom live. So please come to the Zoom live right after watching this presentation. Thank you.